Once upon a time, Ted Turner was headline news, as brash and famous as any tycoon anywhere. Now he's letting his land help shape his legacy.
One man, a loudmouthed, twice-divorced, billionaire media mogul, quietly became the single most powerful conservationist in American history without most people even noticing?
When I was a little boy, about 10 years old, I read National Geographic magazine, and it had an article about bison, and it said how close they came to extinction. I decided that I would do what I could to help bring the bison back.
We're talking about a guy who owns more land than the entire state of Delaware. A man who, while building a media empire that would shake Hollywood to its core, was also out here personally pulling an entire species back from the brink of extinction. Ted Turner's 2-million-acre ranch empire isn't just about big skies and bison burgers. It is a decades-long obsession, equal parts vanity project and genuine ecological miracle. And the full story is far wilder, far messier, and far more fascinating than anyone has ever told you. Buckle up. The man, the myth, the media mogul turned rancher. Let's set the scene. By the late 1980s, Ted Turner was already operating like a man who collected headlines for sport. He launched CNN in 1980, even though critics thought a 24-hour news channel sounded ridiculous. Then he proved them all wrong. He won the America's Cup, owned the Atlanta Braves and the Atlanta Hawks, married Jane Fonda, and gave interviews that probably made PR teams reach for antacids. Ted Turner was everywhere. But behind the larger-than-life image, he was developing a serious obsession with land. Not the casual billionaire version where you buy a pretty ranch for vacation photos. Turner was thinking much bigger than that. It started quietly in 1976, when he bought a ranch in South Carolina. For most people, that would have been enough. For Turner, it was basically the gateway pills. By the 80s and 90s, as cattle ranches across the American West struggled with droughts and falling beef prices, he started buying land at a pace that shocked people around him. Ranch after ranch, state after state, Turner kept writing checks, while locals tried to figure out who this media mogul was and why he suddenly seemed determined to own half the West. Over the next few decades, Turner spent an estimated $2 billion acquiring massive properties across Montana, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, South Carolina, and even Argentina. At one point, he became the largest private landowner in the United States before eventually being edged out by fellow cable billionaire John Malone. What made it all so fascinating was that Turner wasn't collecting ranches like trophies. He had a vision for the land, and it was ambitious, unconventional, and controversial enough to leave people asking one very simple question. What exactly was Ted Turner planning to do with all of it? The crown jewel. Before we go any further, we need to talk about the crown jewel of Ted Turner's land empire, Vermejo Park Ranch. And yes, it really is as absurdly massive as it sounds. Stretching across northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, Vermejo covers roughly 580,000 acres in one continuous block, making it the largest privately owned single-parcel ranch in the United States. For perspective, the entire city of Los Angeles is around 300,000 acres. Vermejo is nearly twice that size. At this point, calling it a ranch almost feels disrespectful. It's basically a private wilderness with property taxes. And Turner didn't buy it just to flex on other billionaires. He actually moved in. His main residence on the property, Casa Grande, is a massive restored mansion that looks like it belongs in a luxury magazine spread. But underneath all the grandeur, Vermejo became something much more personal for him. This ranch turned into the center of Turner's conservation mission and the place where he poured years of money, energy, and frankly obsession into restoring wildlife and ecosystems. That's what makes the whole thing fascinating. The conservation angle isn't some polished PR campaign. Turner genuinely seems invested in protecting the land, sometimes with the intensity of a man who would absolutely corner you at dinner to explain grassland ecology for 45 minutes. Today, Vermejo operates as a luxury ecotourism destination under Ted Turner Expeditions, where wealthy guests come for elk hunting, fly fishing, wildlife tours, and enormous bison herds roaming across restored landscapes. It's often described as a private Yellowstone, except the owner has stronger opinions and significantly more cable news energy. But the tourism was never the real goal. The real mission centered on one animal Turner became determined to bring back, even when many experts thought it was impossible. So what animal was this, and why did bringing it back nearly seem impossible? The bison obsession. Here's the number that really explains Ted Turner's obsession with conservation: 45,000. That's how many American bison now roam Turner's ranches, making it the largest private bison herd on Earth and accounting for roughly 10% of all bison in North America. Which is wild when you remember how close these animals came to disappearing entirely. At their peak, experts estimate there were between 30 and 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains. Herds stretched so far, they reportedly darkened the horizon. Entire indigenous cultures, economies, and traditions were built around them because bison weren't just animals roaming around looking majestic. They were the backbone of the ecosystem itself. Then came the collapse. By 1890, after decades of industrial hunting, habitat destruction, and government policies aimed at destroying indigenous food sources, the bison population had crashed to fewer than 1,000 animals. In the span of about 20 years, one of the most dominant species in North America was nearly wiped out. Not reduced, nearly erased. So when Turner started buying ranches in the 1980s and 90s, the idea of rebuilding massive, free-roaming bison herds sounded unrealistic to a lot of people. Most remaining bison lived in tiny protected herds or zoo-like environments. Large-scale restoration was considered expensive, complicated, and honestly, kind of ridiculous. Turner ignored all of that. What made his project different wasn't just the size of the herds. It was his fixation on genetics. Most people have no idea that many modern bison actually carry traces of cattle DNA because ranchers in the 19th and early 20th centuries experimented with crossbreeding. The hybrids failed, but the genetic impact remained. Turner became determined to build herds that were as genetically pure as possible, meaning animals with little to no cattle ancestry. That required extensive DNA testing, careful breeding programs, and a level of scientific detail that probably made traditional cattle ranchers stare at him like he'd completely lost it. Meanwhile, Turner was reportedly bringing up bison genetics at dinner parties like this was normal small talk, and somehow it worked. Today, Turner's ranches manage some of the most genetically significant bison populations in the world. Conservation groups and wildlife managers now look to his herds for future restoration projects because the animals are considered so valuable genetically. But the bigger surprise was what happened to the land itself. On ranches that had been badly overgrazed for decades, bison triggered major ecological recovery. Unlike cattle, bison naturally move constantly across the landscape, which prevents overgrazing in one spot. Their hooves break up hardened soil. Their wallows create habitats for insects and birds, and the way they graze actually helps native grasses recover. Slowly, damaged ecosystems started coming back. Native grasses returned. Prairie dogs reappeared. Bird species that hadn't nested there in years started showing up again. The bison weren't just surviving. They were rebuilding the landscape around them. But for Turner, the bison were only the beginning. Because the next phase of his conservation mission involved some of the rarest animals on Earth, and depending on who you ask, it was either visionary or completely reckless. Probably both. The secret wildlife programs. Here's where Ted Turner's story stops looking like a billionaire hobby and starts looking like something closer to a private conservation experiment running on sheer willpower. While the bison numbers were making headlines, Turner was quietly backing some of the most ambitious wildlife recovery programs ever attempted on private land. And not in a neat, government-approved, perfectly funded way either. These projects were messy, expensive, controversial, and at several points, one bad year away from collapsing entirely. The standout example is the Mexican gray wolf program. When Turner got involved, fewer than 50 Mexican gray wolves existed in the entire world. Once dominant across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, they had been hunted, trapped, and poisoned almost out of existence. By the time the U.S. officially listed them as endangered, they were basically gone from the wild. Turner's ranches in New Mexico became part breeding ground, part last-ditch rescue operation. And it did not go smoothly. Early on, disease wiped out entire litters. Genetic issues made the already tiny population fragile. Millions were being spent with painfully slow progress to show for it. Even people inside his circle reportedly started questioning whether it was worth continuing. Government agencies were cautious too, because the idea of a private citizen running a predator recovery program raised more than a few eyebrows. Environmental groups also pushed back at times, accusing Turner of playing God, which is a funny phrase when you consider humans had already played demolition crew on the species for over a century. But Turner kept funding it anyway. The same stubborn streak that defined his media career showed up here, just pointed in a different direction. Over time, his breeding programs helped produce wolves that were eventually reintroduced into the wild. The population is still fragile today, still heavily managed, but it exists. And Turner's operation is part of that story in a very real way. Then there's the bison tortoise program, which feels like a completely different kind of gamble. Bison tortoises are ancient, slow-moving giants that can live more than 100 years. They survived ice ages, mammoths, and everything nature threw at them. But they nearly did not survive modern human pressure. By the time Turner got involved, there were fewer than 2,500 left in the wild in a small stretch of the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico. The problem with saving them is almost absurd in its patience requirement. They take 15 to 20 years just to reach breeding age. Females don't even lay eggs regularly. In conservation terms, it is basically the opposite of a quick win. Most experts looked at the timeline and quietly accepted that recovery might not realistically happen at scale. Turner's Ladder Ranch in New Mexico decided to try anyway. Today, it holds one of the largest captive breeding populations of bison tortoises in the world. Hundreds have been produced through carefully managed programs. It is the kind of project that doesn't generate viral clips or dramatic headlines, but it does create something rare in conservation. Time bought back for a species that was running out of it. And then there is the quieter work that barely gets mentioned outside specialist circles. Across his properties in New Mexico and Montana, Turner has supported watershed restoration projects tied to species like the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. These ranches sit on critical headwaters feeding larger river systems, so restoring them has a ripple effect far beyond the property lines. That means removing invasive species, repairing eroded stream banks, and restoring natural water flow patterns so ecosystems downstream benefit too. It is not flashy. Nobody is filming it for documentaries. But it is the kind of work that keeps entire landscapes functioning. So at this point, the conservation record is hard to ignore. The real question becomes less about impact and more about logistics. Because all of this costs a staggering amount of money. Which brings us to the part of Turner's empire most people misunderstand entirely. How exactly does Ted Turner pay for all of this? And what is the business model that keeps the whole empire running? The business of conservation. Here's the part of the story where things get a bit more strategic than sentimental for Ted Turner. Despite what people assume, Turner's ranch empire is not just a billionaire passion project quietly burning through old cable money. It's built like an actual business, deliberately so. Turner Enterprises runs the properties as working landscapes designed to pay their own way, or at least come close, so the conservation work isn't forever dependent on his personal fortune. The most visible piece of that system is Ted's Montana Grill, the restaurant chain Turner co-founded. On paper, it sounded risky. Bison meat was not exactly a mainstream American staple. Beef had dominated plates, advertising, and culture for generations. Most people weren't rejecting bison, they just didn't know what to do with it. Turner's pitch was simple. Bison are leaner than beef, nutritionally dense, and raised in a way that aligns with healthy grassland ecosystems. On his ranches especially, they are part of a system that improves the land rather than degrading it. So every bison burger sold wasn't just food, it was part of a larger conservation loop. The chain actually worked. Ted's Montana Grill expanded across the United States, serving millions of meals and quietly helping normalize bison as a legitimate protein source. And here's the ripple effect people sometimes miss. Once consumers started buying it, other ranchers followed. A market that barely existed suddenly had demand. Turner didn't just sell meat, he helped create an industry around it. That's the pattern across his business model. Conservation and commerce are intentionally tangled together, so one funds the other. Then there's the experiential side of the ranches. Turner's properties generate serious income through regulated hunting and fishing programs. These are not casual weekend trips. We're talking guided hunts and high-end fly fishing experiences that can cost tens of thousands of dollars per visit. The clients come from all over the world. On properties like Vermejo Park Ranch, the fishing alone is a major draw, thanks to decades of habitat restoration that turned degraded streams back into productive ecosystems. Hunting programs are tightly managed with scientific quotas to keep populations healthy while still generating revenue. Turner has long argued that well-managed hunting and conservation aren't opposites, especially when the revenue directly funds habitat restoration and species recovery. It's a controversial idea in some circles, but it has become more widely accepted in modern conservation thinking than it once was. Then there's ecotourism, packaged under Ted Turner expeditions. These are high-end wilderness experiences, wildlife tours, photography trips, and luxury stays on working conservation land. Vermejo acts as the flagship, with its restored landscapes and bison herds functioning almost like a living case study. And yes, there are oil and gas leases on some properties. It's the uncomfortable part of the story. Critics point out the contradiction. Turner's response has generally been pragmatic. The leases are limited, carefully managed, and help fund conservation work at scale. It's not a clean narrative, and it was never really meant to be. Which leaves the bigger question hanging in the air. Because when a billionaire quietly accumulates millions of acres of the American West, restores wildlife at scale, and builds a self-funding conservation machine, the next thing everyone wants to know is what it does to the people who were already living there before the empire showed up. What actually happens to the families who were already there? Economic-wide lifeline or billionaire land grab. This is the part of the story where things get less glossy and a lot more complicated around Ted Turner's ranch empire because, depending on who you ask, his presence in the rural West looks like either an economic lifeline or a billionaire reshaping entire landscapes, according to personal philosophy. And honestly, both of those things can be true at the same time. On one hand, Turner's operations have brought real, measurable benefits to a lot of small communities near his ranches. These are places that had already been dealing with long-term economic decline as traditional cattle ranching became less profitable and younger generations moved away. Turner's properties created jobs in areas that were running out of them. Ranch hands, wildlife biologists, hunting guides, ecotourism staff, hospitality workers, maintenance crews. It is a surprisingly wide ecosystem of employment built around what looks, from a distance, like just open land. Then there is the spending that ripples outward. Local suppliers benefit consistently. Feed companies, fuel providers, veterinarians, equipment dealers. Large ranch operations like these are steady, high-volume customers, and that kind of reliability matters in rural economies where uncertainty is usually the norm. Property taxes are another factor. In several counties, Turner's land holdings contribute significantly to local tax bases, helping fund schools, roads, and emergency services. For some local governments, That revenue has been the difference between stability and deeper cuts. And tourism adds another layer. Hunting programs, fly fishing, and ecotourism experiences bring visitors, often from outside the region and often with money to spend. Small-town hotels, restaurants, and outfitters that had seen declining traffic suddenly find new demand tied directly to ranch operations like Vermejo Park Ranch. But that is only one side of the story. For many longtime ranching families in the region, Turner represents something far more complicated. These are people whose families have worked cattle land for generations, where ranching is not just an industry, but an identity. From their perspective, the shift from cattle country to a conservation-first landscape can feel less like progress and more like cultural displacement. The introduction of large-scale rewilding efforts is especially sensitive. Replacing cattle with bison, restoring predators like wolves and mountain lions, and prioritizing ecological recovery over traditional ranch productivity creates real tension with neighboring ranchers. Because predators do not respect property lines. When they move beyond Turner's land, they interact with neighboring operations. And when that happens, it is often those neighboring ranchers who deal with livestock losses and economic fallout. That has created a persistent point of friction in parts of the rural West, where predator recovery is already one of the most divisive issues in land management. So the broader debate is not simple. It is not a clean story of good or bad, success or failure. It is a collision between ecological restoration at scale and long-standing rural livelihoods, between global conservation goals and local lived experience. Turner's approach is producing measurable environmental results. The land is healthier, wildlife populations are recovering. Conservation science is benefiting from large-scale private experimentation. But those gains exist alongside real cultural and economic disruption for some of the communities living closest to it. And that leaves the bigger question hanging in the air. What happens to a 2-million-acre private conservation empire when the man behind it is no longer there to hold it all together? The legacy. Here's where the whole Ted Turner story starts to feel less like a billionaire flex and more like a question about whether any of this survives him. Because Ted Turner is in his 80s now, and the uncomfortable truth is simple. Everything he built will eventually have to stand without him. And history is not always kind to projects that depend heavily on one person's money, attention, and stubbornness. To his credit, Turner didn't ignore that reality. One of the most important and least flashy parts of his ranch empire is something called conservation easements. These are legal agreements that permanently restrict how land can be used, no matter who owns it in the future. If the property is sold, inherited, or broken up, the restrictions stay in place. The land cannot be developed. The ecosystems cannot be converted. The conservation purpose is locked in. In practical terms, Turner has taken billions of dollars worth of land and voluntarily reduced its future commercial value in exchange for one thing: permanence. Not all of his holdings are fully covered, and the full structure of a 2-million-acre multi-state estate is complex. But a significant portion of it is now legally tied to conservation outcomes that outlive him. That alone puts his ranch system in a different category than most private land empires. Then there is the scientific legacy, which may prove just as durable. Turner's ranches have become important field sites for conservation research across North America. Universities, government agencies, and independent scientists have used his land to study everything from grassland recovery to predator-prey dynamics to bison genetics and watershed restoration. In many ways, these properties function like large-scale outdoor laboratories. And Turner didn't just allow that to happen. He invested in it. Monitoring systems, tracking technology, water quality networks, and formal research partnerships have turned parts of his ranches into long-term ecological study zones. The result is a growing body of peer-reviewed science that extends far beyond his fences and will continue shaping conservation practice long after the properties themselves change hands. There is also a larger idea embedded in all of this, whether Turner ever said it directly or not, that private landowners, if they operate at enough scale and commitment, can sometimes achieve conservation outcomes that rival public systems. It is a controversial comparison, but not an empty one. National parks remain essential, but they are often constrained by funding limits, political cycles, and bureaucratic delays. Turner's system, by contrast, can move quickly, take risks, and commit to long timelines in ways public agencies sometimes struggle to match. That is how projects like Mexican gray wolf recovery efforts, bison tortoise breeding programs, pure-line bison restoration, and large-scale watershed rehabilitation were able to progress at all. Not because they were easy, but because someone kept paying for them when they weren't. Which leads to the bigger, slightly uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of it. Is this a model anyone else can actually replicate, or is it a one-off story shaped by extreme wealth, timing, and one very particular personality? The honest answer is somewhere in the middle. Parts of it can be replicated. The tools exist, the science exists, the land management strategies exist. But the scale, the patience, and the willingness to fund long-shot ecological recovery for decades at a time is harder to copy. So what remains is not a neat blueprint, but a challenge. Because if conservation on this level is possible at all, then the question is no longer whether it can be done. It is who, if anyone, will actually do it next. The verdict. Let's be honest for a second, because the full story of Ted Turner's ranch empire would be doing everyone a disservice if it ended on a triumphant note without acknowledging the contradictions. Because Ted Turner is, above all else, a deeply contradictory figure, and his empire reflects that completely. He is a man who has spent billions restoring native ecosystems while simultaneously holding energy leases that extract fossil fuels from some of those same properties. He has championed wildlife conservation while running hunting programs that charge wealthy clients tens of thousands of dollars to shoot the very animals he has worked to restore. He has spoken passionately about environmental responsibility while building a personal empire of land ownership so vast it would be considered extraordinary in any era of human history. He has generated enormous economic benefits for some rural communities while being viewed by others as a symbol of exactly the kind of concentrated wealth and power that has historically made life harder for working people in the American West. None of those contradictions cancel out the ecological results. But they are real. And anyone who tells you the Ted Turner conservation story is a simple story of a hero saving the wilderness has not been paying close enough attention. What is undeniable, what the land itself testifies to, is the scale of what has been accomplished. The bison are there, 45,000 of them, genetically healthy, roaming across restored grasslands that were overgrazed wastelands a single generation ago. The wolves are there, cautiously, precariously, facing ongoing threats, but present in the wild, in numbers that seemed impossible 30 years ago, and present in part because of what Turner's breeding programs accomplished. The bison tortoises are breeding on the Ladder Ranch, ancient animals outlasting a century that tried to erase them. The Rio Grande cutthroat trout are in streams that had been degraded beyond function. The watersheds are healing. The research is happening, and the science is spreading outward into the broader conservation world. And here is the truth that is easy to miss when you are focused on the contradictions. Ted Turner did not have to do any of this. He was already one of the most famous, most successful, most controversial figures in American media. He could have bought beautiful land, put some cattle on it, hosted friends for the occasional hunting weekend, and nobody would have thought twice about it. That is what most people with his resources do. Instead, he spent over $2 billion building something that almost no one thought was possible. A private conservation empire that has measurably moved the needle on species recovery and ecological restoration at a scale that governments have struggled to match. He took the risks that bureaucracies can't take, maintained the long-time horizons that quarterly earnings calls make impossible, and built something that will, if the legal structures hold and the conservation easements do their work, outlast him by generations. Whatever you think of Ted Turner the man, and people have extremely strong opinions in every direction, what he has built across 2 million acres of the American West is extraordinary. It is the kind of thing that people will still be studying, arguing about, and pointing to as either a model or a cautionary tale decades from now. One man's obsession, 2 million acres, $2 billion, 45,000 bison, and several species that are still here because one loud, difficult, visionary, contradictory human being decided they should be. Ted Turner's ranch empire is not a simple story, and anyone who tries to tell you it is hasn't been paying attention. It is a story about what becomes possible when someone with extraordinary resources makes an extraordinary bet. Not on a company, not on a stock, not on a technology, but on the land itself and the creatures that belong to it. It is a story about the complicated, sometimes uncomfortable relationship between private wealth and public good, between individual vision and collective consequence, between what the American West was and what it might still become. It is also, when you strip everything else away, a story about 45,000 bison thundering across grasslands that weren't supposed to survive, and the stubborn, loud, difficult, occasionally infuriating, genuinely visionary man who decided they would. If this story landed differently than you expected, if it made you think about land and conservation and what we owe to the species we've pushed to the edge, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the next story in this series goes somewhere you will not see coming.